In some ways, Hamas is understanding that negotiations don't work. Popular mobilization and unarmed resistance doesn't work. The only time that Israel starts responding actually to the demands in 2018 and to begin alleviating the impact of the blockade is when Hamas fires rockets. So there's no way to engage with Israel that isn't through force.
There are some things you're simply not allowed to do in British media. And prime amongst them is talk about Hamas as if they're anything other than brutal, bloodthirsty, monstrous, and irrational. But that moralistic framing doesn't really tell you anything about anything. How did Hamas come to govern Gaza? Why did they choose to contest elections at all? What was the strategic reasoning behind October 7th? And what does the future hold for Palestinian armed struggle after more than 2 years of ongoing genocide? Tareq Baconi is one of the very few people I've heard addressing these questions in public. His 2018 book, Hamas Contained, is an immaculately researched analysis of the period between 2007 and 2017 when Hamas and Israel occupied an uneasy equilibrium. We talk about the history of Hamas and how the movement might evolve, but we also talk about his beautiful memoir published this year called Fire in Every Direction, about his upbringing in Jordan. I hope you enjoy the interview. Tareq Baconi, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you for having me.
I've been wanting to do this for so long. I've been so excited. So we're here to talk about two of your books. One is Hamas Contained. The other is Fire in Every Direction. They are two very different kind of books. I realised when I opened the second one, expecting a follow-up to Hamas Contained, and got a really beautiful memoir instead. How many other people had that experience?
I'm pretty sure quite a few. Quite a few. I leave people on their toes.
Yeah, I was like, when's Yahya Sinwar going to be in this one?
He does not feature.
He does not pop up. So we're gonna talk about these two separately. In terms of Hamas Contained, which is really it's an analysis of the period, post Oslo up to 2018. What led you to write not just a book on Hamas, but that book on Hamas?
Well, I mean, the book came out of my doctorate thesis. During my doctorate, I was focused on a very particular period. I was looking at Hamas between 2000 and 2010. So just before the Second Intifada started with the collapse of the Camp David Accords, up to a couple of years after the blockade and just before the second Israeli military assault on the Gaza Strip, because I felt that period was very important in terms of understanding Hamas's life cycle. It had gone from being essentially an armed military force that's existing outside of the political system, very active during the Second Intifada, very active in armed resistance, into becoming a democratically elected party. And within the period of less than 18 months after winning democratic elections through American and Israeli intervention, there's a civil war, to try to prevent an Israeli and American coup on those elections. And then Hamas becomes a governing authority in the Gaza Strip existing under blockade. And so the series of transformations felt like the movement had gone through a very extreme reformulation of itself, how it functions in the Palestinian political system. So I was very interested in understanding these transformations and mapping them out. But when I finished the doctorate and I was thinking about a book project, it dawned on me that actually to understand that period, we needed to understand Hamas's full life cycle. And so the book ended up being a 30-year history, 1987 to 2017. And, as part of that research, I went into Palestine, went into Gaza, and did the work that I needed to do.
In terms of thinking about the historical parallels for Hamas, is there any other group you can think of that underwent that sort of hot-boxed period of transformation? Because obviously there are other parallels for, anti-imperial or anti-colonial armed groups, but having gone from, militant group to having a political faction to governing body to civil war to governing under blockade, is there anything else that is?
I mean, It's quite, as you say, there are quite a few armed groups that go into politics. I think what makes this in some ways exceptional, and it's not just Hamas, it's also the PLO before Hamas, is that there is this transition from armed resistance into some kind of political slash governing role without the structure of occupation, without the adversary actually having been challenged. So the resistance is still ongoing, but somehow these parties then end up being embroiled in a political system that in some ways is designed to ensure that they get pacified. And so, before Hamas, the PLO went from an armed resistance group into a group that offered concessions, sort of renounced quote unquote terrorism as one of the conditions that were placed on it in order for it to enter the diplomatic process, and recognized the state of Israel, and then entered into negotiations that culminated in the Oslo Accords, which, as we all know now, and as many said then, was a sign of defeat. And so they entered into a political process having lost. On the occupiers' terms. And so the cause, if you will, of resistance was still there, even as they transitioned into a political process. And it was the same thing for Hamas, and it complicated Hamas's political experience because the movement naively, maybe wrongly believed that they could go into these political systems and revolutionize the political systems to advance their military aims, their resistance aims. But what ended up happening was a more complicated relationship between governance and resistance.
I want to go right to the very beginning. So Hamas's origins, who's involved in setting it up? Where are they from? What's their political and religious background? And why do they feel the need to pursue a military strategy right at the time when the PLO is sort of renouncing its armed struggle?
So the foundation for Hamas really is the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. So this is obviously a movement that began in Egypt in the 1920s and then really takes off in Palestine in the 1940s. So before Hamas is formed or established in 1987, we have about 4 decades of the Muslim Brotherhood being active in Palestine. And during this period, the Muslim Brotherhood is focused on what they call Islamization. So their mission is not to challenge the occupation. Their mission is to ensure that the Palestinian society is living a virtuous life, that there's a sense of Islamic morals that are being widespread or that are being spread throughout the community. So it's in some ways a welfare association or a welfare movement. They have charities and orphanages and healthcare centers and kindergartens and schools, and it's all looking at the social fabric of Palestinian life. Now, over the course of those 4 decades, there's obviously resistance from Palestinians to the occupation, and primarily from Fatah, which is the nationalist movement that starts up and then eventually takes over the PLO once the PLO is formed. But throughout this period, the Muslim Brotherhood is really just focused on welfare issues. And then by the 1980s, as you say, a few things are happening. One is that the PLO, after decades of armed resistance, is beginning to understand that their only way for them to enter into a diplomatic process is if they accede to these demands of the international community to recognize Israel, to renounce armed resistance, and to sort of essentially become a body that's interested in negotiating, having given up the thawabit, the sort of the fixed principles of the Palestinian struggle, which is non-partition, the full liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea, and the right of return. And so as the PLO is making this shift, there's also agitation that's happening within the occupied territories. There's greater resistance that's happening almost organically. By 1987, this culminates in the First Intifada, which is mass uprising that's happening against the occupation, and that's all led by people in the occupied territories as versus the PLO, which is active abroad. And so that starts putting pressure on the Muslim Brotherhood to start thinking about, what is their role in this? There's mass spread mobilization, there's resistance. What is this idea of Islamization? And in some ways, the clinch comes from within the Islamist movement itself. So in the early 1980s, Islamic Jihad spins out of the Muslim Brotherhood and says, actually, we have to flip this over on its head. It's not Islamization until liberation. It's liberation, then Islamization. So whereas the Muslim Brotherhood thought that only once we have a virtuous society can we liberate? Can we really confront the occupation? Islamic Jihad turns that on its head and says, actually, one must confront the occupation now in order to have the sovereignty to build the kind of society that we want. And so, so there's pressure coming against the Muslim Brotherhood also from within the Islamist
And how are they
ranks.
working with, I suppose, secular forces at that time? Was there a sense of a pact, or like, okay, well, we can agree on this, and then afterwards we're going to have our, big disagreement on what we want society to look like? Or was it a case of these differences are too big for us to unite?
Over the course of the decades when the Muslim Brotherhood was active and Fatah was engaged in resistance, and not just Fatah, the leftist groups as well, PFLP and DFLP, there was a lot of tension between those movements. In some ways, there was a sense that the Muslim Brotherhood was also working with the occupation because obviously they needed licenses to operate their schools, to operate their kindergartens, to operate their orphanages. And because they weren't active in resistance, the occupation didn't view them as a threat. And so there was a lot of tension between Palestinian parties that were engaged in resistance and between the Muslim Brotherhood. And as the Muslim Brotherhood was starting to sort of understand that its role might be one of resistance, some of these confrontations would become more acrimonious and often would happen under Israeli oversight. So the Israeli soldiers would be in the occupied territories, would see clashes, and wouldn't necessarily intervene to try to prevent that kind, because in some ways they were very much invested in a colonial divide and rule tactic. And so in some ways they were, and this is, you might have heard the sort of people often say, Hamas is Israel's creation, which I don't think is accurate. Hamas is very much indigenous to the Palestinian people and comes out of a long history of sort of this Islamist ideology within Palestine. But the Israeli occupation forces certainly allowed them to exist and often encouraged them to exist in a way that threatened the secular forces and that threatened the nationalist forces.
I mean, it's definitely, should we say, something of a meme on social media of, well, Hamas is a creation of Israel, or Hamas was materially supported by Israel. Is it simply a case that Hamas was in some ways beneficial to Israeli interests because it means that you're inhibiting the possibility of a politically unified single Palestinian state, or were there forms of material support?
Well, I mean, Hamas was certainly beneficial to the Israeli regime in different ways across its life cycle. So in those early years that we're talking about, it was beneficial to the Israeli regime because of divide and rule tactics. So it allowed, as you say, it prevented rather the formulation of this cohesive political body that can speak on behalf of all Palestinians. And Hamas viewed itself as outside of the PLO, specifically, this is the late 1980s, for the reason that the PLO recognized Israel. And Hamas was opposed to the recognition of Israel, continues to be opposed to the recognition of Israel. So there was a major split within the Palestinian liberation struggle that certainly Israel benefited from. But if you fast forward a couple of decades and we have Hamas as a governing authority in the Gaza Strip, it's beneficial to Israel for another reason, which is that now Israel can claim that, look, there's a security situation in the Gaza Strip. That's why we must put the Gaza Strip under blockade. The reality is that the blockade preceded Hamas. In many ways, the Gaza Strip has been a thorn in Israel's side since 1948. And the reason is demographic. They want to get rid of the 2 million Palestinians there in order to ensure a Jewish majority between the river and the sea. And so Hamas then became the perfect fig leaf. And that's what I argue in the book, that it becomes the perfect fig leaf that retroactively justifies the blockade. And so while Israel is demonizing Hamas, this bloodthirsty terrorist organization that's irrational, it's doing everything in its power to make sure that Hamas is stabilized as a governing authority in the Gaza Strip, including, as you say, material support. And that's money that's coming from Qatar, being funneled in with full Israeli coordination into Hamas, into Hamas as the government of the Gaza Strip, to make sure it doesn't collapse.
I'm really interested in what happens in 1994 for Hamas. So there is a development in its military strategy. There is the use of suicide bombings as a tactic by Hamas for the first time, I think. How did the military strategy develop over time? So through the 1980s into this period in the mid-90s.
So initially, Hamas's military strategy is quite basic, and also its ideology is quite basic. So it's not really a sophisticated movement. in terms of it being an armed resistance movement. And you get that sense from its charter, the way that it doesn't differentiate between Jewishness and Zionism, the way that it talks about certain aspects of the Palestinian struggle. It's really a movement that's quite basic and ill-informed. And on the military front, its tactics are quite weak. They entail abducting soldiers, Israeli occupation forces, and killing them and doing a number of these operations. And then there's a shift that happens in the early 90s, and this is following a period when Hamas's leadership is exiled. They're sort of sent into South Lebanon because of these military activities that are starting to take shape. And this is a really, it's an Israeli move that backfires for two reasons. First, it places Hamas's leadership under international stage, these Palestinians that are being exiled and stripped of their citizenship, and gives them a political platform where they can start talking to international news organizations, whereas Israel would have prevented that if they were still under occupation. And the second is because it starts ties with Hezbollah. And this is where Hamas really begins to encounter the tactic of suicide bombing and to start thinking about what those kinds of martyrdom operations would look like if they were to happen inside Palestine. And so by the 1990s, we see this organization that is beginning to focus on developing its domestic capabilities to advance its military tactics and to sort of begin exploring different ways to challenge the occupation.
I don't want this to come across like a crass question, but what is it that suicide bombings are able to do, which is different from, say, something like a car bombing or, planting a bomb and walking away? Like, is there something about legitimacy? Is there something about the way in which a form of sacrifice is sort of built in there? Like, what is the sort of political work that tactic is doing, which is different from the forms of armed struggle and violence that they were doing before?
I mean, in some ways, it was the way that I read it, at least, it was more about Hamas's capabilities. Having someone act as a suicide bomber was, in terms of capabilities, I think more possible than having a car bomb. In terms of that car would have to cross a checkpoint and get into different facilities or get into military zones where the occupation forces are active. There's a certain degree of mobility that a suicide bomber has that I don't think that other forms and other tactics do. So I think it was a calculation in terms of, there's a military calculation in terms of how could a certain military operation go. And then there's a strategic calculation. And I have to say here that, and a huge moral calculation. As someone who's sort of read through Hamas's archives, it's clear to me that this wasn't a straightforward decision within the movement. I think these were very complicated questions about how one fights the morality of carrying out attacks of this kind and the strategic value of doing something like that. The biggest question being, would this actually cause Israel to withdraw and force this fear within Israeli society that would compel the society to sort of put pressure on the leadership to evacuate from the occupied territories, or would it backfire? And I think these questions trailed Hamas, the strategic questions, the military questions, the moral questions, trailed Hamas throughout its engagement with these sort of suicide bombings, all the martyrdom operations that it did, but also other operations, the missile fires and after that.
So what was the balance of terror campaign? So how did that work? What did that look like for Hamas?
Well, Hamas, this is, so just for the listeners, so this was a very specific campaign that Hamas initiated during the Second Intifada. So this was a period, so the Second Intifada was a period in which, the high hopes that Palestinians and certainly others had towards the Oslo Accords, the peace process of the 1990s, had collapsed. It was clear by this stage that Israel had no intention of meeting the bare minimum that Palestinians had desired or hoped for, even after the Palestinians had given historic concessions in terms of recognizing the state of Israel on 78% of their homeland.
I mean, Edward Said says that
it was the Palestinian Versailles.
It was this sort of historic humiliation for
Yes,
nothing.
for nothing. And so he would have been able to say that in the early 1990s. By the 2000s, it was apparent that this was the case. And so there was a huge level of frustration and despair among the Palestinians. And when the Second Intifada erupted, incidentally, it erupted in some ways similar to the First Intifada. It was mass uprising, uncoordinated, organic, and wasn't necessarily militarized on the onset, but the Israelis retaliated with a disproportionate amount of firepower, specifically bullets used against Palestinian protesters, that the Second Intifada very quickly militarized. And so the Palestinian factions, not only Hamas, although the focus is on Hamas in discourse in the West, but not only Hamas, Fatah Tanzim, Fatah, and other Palestinian factions all engaged in armed resistance, including suicide bombings throughout the occupied territories and within Israel itself. And in some ways, actually, Hamas didn't have the most suicide operations, but it by far had the most effective. It had throughout the 90s developed this tactic and had by this stage sufficient internal capabilities within the movement to carry out its operations. So this sort of armed resistance is coming from the Palestinians, and the Israelis are really the incursions into the occupied territories, into specific refugee camps like Jenin and Tul Karem are devastating. They're devastating infrastructure. They're killing civilians by the hundreds. The militarization and the invasion into the occupied territories is unlike anything that had been seen to that date. And so Hamas at that stage developed its balance of terror doctrine, which is to say, for every civilian that is killed by Israelis, we are going to kill Israeli civilians. It was basically a calculation to say you cannot continue to murder Palestinian civilians with no accountability. If the international community is not going to hold you accountable, we will. And so they tried to have this balance where whenever civilian centers are invaded, whenever Palestinian innocents are killed, Hamas would carry out an operation in retaliation, and it would say this is in retaliation to this is in retaliation to that. The strategic thinking behind this was that if the Israelis, and this is the Israeli community, the Israeli citizens, are to feel the terror that Palestinians feel, the terror that Israelis are creating in Palestinian communities, then maybe they would understand. Maybe they would rethink their support for a government that's maintaining its occupation and preventing Palestinian self-determination.
What actually happened in terms of the Israeli electorate in response to the Balance of Terror campaign? What happened in terms of the mood?
Well, I don't know if it was specifically in response to the Balance of Terror campaign, but what was happening in the Israeli community was the opposite of what Hamas had anticipated, which is that Ariel Sharon gets elected as prime minister. So this is someone who is a hawk, someone who in the past had been instrumental in the extermination of Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. In some ways, the precursor to the genocide that we see today. So this is someone who is committed to the greater land of Israel. He's a Likud hawk, and who has no interest in negotiating or even pretending that Palestinians have political aspirations. The only interest is militarily quashing any kind of Palestinian resistance or any kind of Palestinian claim to rights within the land of historic Palestine. So he's only approaching all of this from a military perspective, not a political perspective at all. And so within that context, Hamas's operations, and not just Hamas, but the Palestinian armed resistance generally, is not seen as something that could strategically be negotiated in order to figure out, what Hamas is hoping to figure out. Hamas is doing these operations and saying, we will stop carrying out bombings in 48 in Israel if you stop carrying out bombings in the West Bank. Right? It's using armed resistance strategically in order to achieve political goals, in order to negotiate politically with the Israeli authorities. And the Israeli authorities have no interest in doing that. And they're fully supported by the Bush administration in the US, which is post 9/11 committed to this idea of war on terror. And the language that it uses sort of places Hamas with this war on terror.
It's something that you write
framework.
in the book, which I thought was so interesting, that in terms of how the Second Intifada was being messaged to the rest of the West, it was trying to say, look, this is our version of 9/11. So it was about taking the Second Intifada out of a context of occupation, of colonial expansion, of settlement, of apartheid, and instead saying, this is like 9/11 for us.
Absolutely, and doing that very effectively, in an American context where actually any kind of Palestinian armed resistance is then seen as then Al Qaeda, and that obviously evolves and today is seen as ISIS in some iterations. But it completely decontextualizes Palestine, this long history of armed resistance for rights that are recognized internationally within UN Security Council resolutions, and it then makes any kind of armed resistance bloodthirsty and irrational, as if the idea is that Palestinians are simply trying to terrorize Israelis. It sort of removes any of the political aims behind Palestinian armed resistance, and in some ways gives the Israeli government a carte blanche. So the way the Bush administration is thinking is, we can devastate Afghanistan, we can devastate Iraq because of 9/11 with no proof of anything, with no strategic value. And similarly, the Israelis can devastate the Palestinians because of 9/11, because this is, the Palestinian armed resistance is their domestic Al Qaeda.
I realize I'm jumping around in time a bit, but it's because there's so many sort of simultaneous threads that need looking at. How does Hamas develop a political wing and a political strategy? And why does it do that? Why does it not just say, right, we're going to do, a military arms struggle, we're going to be, a set of military groups, someone else can do the politics? Why is it that they pursue politics?
It's a good question. And I think, if you were to ask Hamas leaders then and now, there would be a range of answers about why they end up doing this. I mean, to ground us back in the Second Intifada, this is a moment when the balance of terror is clearly not having the effect that Hamas wants, and rather than having any kind of shift in the balance of forces for the Israelis actually end up doing a number of things. One is they decide to withdraw their settlements from the Gaza Strip. So this happens in 2005 in order to focus their occupation on the West Bank. And obviously the occupation on the Gaza Strip isn't dismantled, but there are no more settlers there. And they decimate the Palestinian political system. So they, Yasser Arafat is by this stage is 2004 has been killed or died, and the Hamas's political leaders, the majority of them are executed by the Israelis, and the Palestinian political system lies in tatters. And here are the Americans pushing forward this idea of democratization. They want to democratize Iraq, and they want to democratize the Palestinian Authority. So there's this very significant push towards elections happening within the context of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And so Hamas is placed in this position where there's clearly on the military front, it hasn't had the gains that it had hoped. And there's a very significant push on the political front. And the movement thinks, in 1996, which is the first time those elections happened in Palestine, but the first and the last, this is when the Palestinian Authority was established as part of the Oslo Accords, Hamas boycotted the elections and said, we do not recognize the State of Israel. We do not recognize the Oslo Accords. We will not partake in anything that legitimates that.
And what did that do for Hamas's own legitimacy in the eyes of Palestinians?
It strengthened it. I mean, because for many Palestinians, Oslo was a capitulation. And so Hamas then was in its purest form as this sort of military power that's committed to the full liberation of Palestine. In some ways, very much in opposition to these political parties, right? Very much in opposition to Fatah and others that had gone into Oslo and gone into negotiations. I mean, some Palestinians would have opposed Hamas's thinking and seen it as a spoiler, that it was undermining negotiations, and others understood that the negotiations were not going anywhere and actually Hamas was holding the line. But by 2006, Hamas comes out and says the Palestinian political establishment has been decimated. There's no Oslo anymore. It's clear that there's no Oslo anymore. So we want to run in these elections not as a legitimation of Oslo, but as a party that wants to revolutionize, to rebuild something new, to rebuild a new political establishment that, unlike Oslo, is committed to resistance. And so it goes into these elections with that mandate in mind.
Hey, you, there's a newsletter about downstream. I'm contractually obligated to try and hype this, so don't waste my time. Basically, go to novara.media/downstream newsletter and sign up for some behind the scenes glimpses of how we put the interview together, some bonus quickfire questions, and occasionally a searing hot take from myself, or better yet, Aaron. So sign up, novara.media/downstream newsletter. I mean, there's talk of creating a resistant society,
Right.
I think is the quote you use in your book, which is there will be an economy of resistance, an education of resistance, that all of these different systems within Gaza would be dedicated to the cause of resistance. What did that look like in terms of Hamas's vision? Was it just rhetoric, or was there a real plan?
I don't think it was just rhetoric. I do think that it was a plan. I think it was a plan in terms of redesigning this body, the Palestinian Authority, which had been designed and envisioned and imagined by Oslo to be a body that really pacifies Palestinians under occupation, that makes sure that Palestinians are economically tied in a way that makes resistance impossible. Their livelihoods are based on humanitarian aid, on an economy that Israel sustains, in some ways controls through tax revenue. The movement of people in and out of the occupied territories is managed by the PA through security coordination with Israel. I mean,
also technological de-development. So,
everything.
Gaza going from the car to beasts of burden because of the blockade.
Well, the blockade hadn't started by this point. The blockade starts in 2007, but the Palestinian Authority before that absolutely has de-development throughout the 1990s, after its creation, de-development even before then. But this idea that the Palestinian economy would become subservient to Israel. And so the whole idea of the Palestinian Authority was to pacify Palestinians. It was this facade of state building under occupation. And so Hamas's vision was to completely dismantle that and to think about other things. How could Palestinians sustain themselves? What kind of agricultural work would happen if Palestinians actually depended on their own output, had access to their agricultural land, was able to develop jobs that were not dependent on Israel or Israeli. So just to build steadfastness and resilience, and to think about sort of breaking out of this neoliberal policy that had been placed on Palestinians in order to develop more capacity for resistance.
And so in terms of what the election campaign itself was like, what were the kinds of dividing lines on issues other than Oslo that Hamas was drawing between itself and Fatah?
I mean, a big part of that was corruption, was sort of saying, look, Fatah is claiming to be working on behalf of the people, but they are all now rich politicians who are completely disconnected from what the Palestinians on the street want. And the PA by this stage was disgustingly corrupt, as it continues to be. And so Hamas, in some ways, the corruption was the biggest factor that Hamas was able, unlike Fatah, Hamas's leaders, at least to a large extent then, and in some cases until now, were very connected to the streets because of this history of Hamas coming out of the Muslim Brotherhood, of that social infrastructure. They were really embedded in the community. Many of its leaders lived in refugee camps still.
So was there a class distinction?
Absolutely. There was a huge class distinction. There was a lot of Hamas's members were professionals, middle-class professionals, lawyers, doctors, engineers, who had sort of left these respectable positions and taken up political positions in Hamas. And in some ways was lower middle class and very connected to the people. Were not corrupt. Were seen as devout, very religious, and so were seen as having that. And I think the other big element was this disgust with the false promise of negotiations. And Hamas kept saying, we've been negotiating for all these years, for what? And so it was able to position itself, in some ways, it was able to position itself as the outsider to the incumbent.
So what happens then? I mean, of course, Hamas becomes the government in Gaza. 2007, you have the blockade. You phrased it as government under blockade, as being this thing which is quite unique in a way. So in what ways were the conditions of blockade impacting Hamas's ability to pursue the kind of state-building enterprise that it wanted to? And did it have an effect of delegitimizing Hamas in the eyes of Gaza civilians, or the opposite? Did it sort of strengthen the resolve under the sort of coercive force of the blockade?
I mean, in some ways, So Hamas wins, comes into power, and then the reaction is very swift from the Israelis, from the Americans. In some ways, the Americans led this international reaction, which was immediately to ring fence Hamas, to stop all funds going into the government, and to try to strengthen Fatah, even militarily, in order to push Fatah to carry out a coup, essentially. And so Hamas immediately, I mean, this idea that it would build a government of resistance is immediately cut short, because Hamas is now facing a potential coup and is blockaded entirely across the occupied territories, not just in the Gaza Strip. And, fast forward, there's a civil war, civil strife, and Hamas takes over Gaza and basically pushes out Fatah from the Gaza Strip, and that's when the blockade becomes sealed. So that's when, whereas before all the Palestinian Authority was under blockade, this now is the Israeli and American effort to isolate Hamas. They isolate Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and they place the Gaza Strip under this brutal blockade. So, of course, initially the movement is focused on surviving, as are Palestinians in Gaza, and they do that very effectively through tunnels. They build tunnels or dig tunnels specifically into Egypt in order to allow medicines, food, goods to come in. And the movement slowly starts building itself as a governing authority. This is a movement that hadn't been in government ever. And because of all of the efforts to marginalize it, Fatah wasn't necessarily in a handover mode. And so really the move...
So there wasn't, the stacks of binders to hand over.
And more than that, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank put a decree on all of the civil service employees in the Gaza Strip to not go to work, because they were working with the Israelis to try to undermine Hamas. And so really this is a movement that's trying to come into effective government, it's learning as it goes along. And it's a difficult process for all the reasons. It's a difficult process, and then the blockade, which is stifling and a form of collective punishment on 2 million Palestinians. How is that received among Palestinians in Gaza? I mean, in some ways, Hamas is seen as an effective governing body that's able to have some kind of security hold on Gaza. Whereas before there was security chaos, certainly in the months of the civil war, there was a lot of disruption and chaos in Gaza. Hamas comes in and very quickly, with the police force, is able to get Gaza back to a relatively stable place, and begins to govern. I mean, very quickly begins to govern effectively. But there's a balancing dance, which we can talk about, between sort of Hamas being a governing body and a resistance body that shapes how Palestinians in Gaza also react to it.
Well, that was going to be my next question, which is... at this period in time, so thinking about 2006, 2007, 2008, are Hamas's political aims and its political strategy and its military aims and strategy, are they in alignment, or are there tensions there?
So there are tensions. There are tensions in the sense that several things are happening. First of all, I don't know that the movement was very effective, at least in the early years, at separating the government, so Hamas's governing authority, from the movement. And whereas the movement was still obviously a military resistance operation, a military resistance movement committed to the full liberation of Palestine, the governing body had to govern, had to provide education and healthcare and all of the social requirements that the government has.
Was there competition for resources? You've got a political wing, right, which is like, hey, look, we want our welfare system. You've got a military wing being like, please, could we have some more arms?
Right. And in some ways, there was separation between those two. And so there was the government was able to raise its own funds through taxation and other forms of government revenue that was different in some ways than how the military approached its own revenues, and it developed its own capabilities. But there was still tension in the way that the two... just in the way that Hamas was able to adapt as a governing body. And more importantly, in the way that if there was a resistance operation, which there were, and by 2008, we get the first instance of an Israeli military assault on the Gaza Strip, that the resistance in some ways it complicates governance, because this isn't a party that's outside of the governing body. This is a party that is also a governing body that's now engaged in active resistance. And so it's a complicated balance for Hamas Hamas to get right. But in some ways, this idea that you had asked about building this society of resistance. In some ways, Hamas achieves exactly that. The Gaza Strip becomes a place where life for civilians is continuing apart from the blockade relatively normally, and the government is a government of resistance. It's still committed to fighting Israel and fighting the Israelis in various forms.
There's a fascinating quote from what you describe as a key member of Israel's security establishment who said, during this period, Israel needs Hamas to be weak enough not to attack, but stable enough to deal with the radical terrorist groups in Gaza. The line may be blurry, but the logic is clear. The challenge lies with walking this blurry line. How long did Israel's establishment, but also, the Hamas leadership think that they could walk this blurry line of you've got a governance of resistance, but can't get too strong, otherwise Israel comes in too hard, but you have to keep it going. I mean, how long did they think they could sustain this sort of very strange, tense status quo?
I mean, on the Israeli side, I think they thought indefinitely, and the biggest error on the Israeli side is that they never had which is not limited to Gaza, it's only towards the Palestinians generally, is that they never have a strategy. Their goal is to manage the Palestinians, right? To make sure that they keep maintaining Palestinians pacified, that they make sure that any form of resistance is dismantled. The idea is never actually to resolve the Palestinian political question. The idea is to manage it. And so from the perspective of Gaza, where some of these questions are heightened, from the Israeli side, the idea, there was no strategy for dealing with Gaza. There was complete delusion that this blockade could be sustainable. In the same way that people might say, well, you know what, the occupation isn't sustainable, but now it's been sustainable for 70 plus years. So the Israelis are approaching Gaza from this idea that, the blockade, it will just be the blockade and we'll have to deal with it. Clearly, after October 7th, we understand that from Hamas's perspective, there was every effort in terms of thinking about the fact that that blockade is not sustainable and that it will have to be disrupted at some point.
But in terms of the mechanisms for containment, I mean, the level of thinking that was going in on the Israeli side, as far as managing the calorific intake for Gazan civilians, I mean, it wasn't just we've stumbled on this tactic, which is containment. They were very carefully designing it. So what were the mechanisms involved?
I mean, the containment, the idea, as you said, or as that Israeli source said, was very much to maintain Hamas, not just Hamas, to maintain the Gaza Strip generally, Hamas as the governing authority, but also the Palestinian population in Gaza, just above the brink of collapse. That was the goal, that if Gaza collapses into a humanitarian situation where there's mass starvation, then there will be international pressure on Israel to deal with the blockade. And if Gaza thrives, then that is something that is going to also challenge the blockade and possibly be a bit of a headache for the Israeli desire to sort of maintain Gaza out of headlines, invisible. And so the idea was to manage it just above a humanitarian collapse. And so that meant controlling very carefully the amount of food, the amount of medicine, the amount of imports that were allowed into Gaza, controlling who can leave the Gaza Strip and for what. So the number of Palestinians from Gaza who work in 48 in Israel, managing the number of permits of people in and out, which is their valve for managing the economy in Gaza, and militarily to do what they call mowing the lawn, which is every few years they go in, they carry out an operation to make sure that on the military front, Hamas isn't able to develop its capabilities. Obviously, these military operations are not focused on Hamas. They kill tens, if not hundreds of civilians, but they sort of maintain an Israeli military edge.
And in terms of, this mowing the lawn tactic or approach, what was Hamas's sense of how it would prepare for it? And was there ever a point, before October the 7th, where there were conversations about launching a much more aggressive attack into 48?
Well, Hamas, so during this period, and specifically I would say the period from when the blockade is sort of sealed in 2007 to 2021, which is when Palestinians had their unity intifada. So during this period, the relationship is one that I call an equilibrium, a violent equilibrium of violence, whereby every time the blockade becomes too stifling, that the economy is about to collapse, Hamas is feeling the pressure of Palestinians in Gaza being unable to eat or unable to have a normal functioning society. Hamas could throw a rocket or could challenge the blockade, and that would result in an escalation. Often case, this is predated by a period when there's a ceasefire, and as part of the ceasefire, Israel would have committed to allowing more food in, aid trucks in, giving more permits to Palestinians in Gaza to leave, and it invariably doesn't fulfill.
I was going to say, what was Israeli compliance with terms of the ceasefire?
It was never.
Like?
I mean, and this is I'm sure we'll talk about the ceasefire today. But all of the ceasefire agreements between Hamas and Israel were such that there's an immediate cessation of violence. Then Israel is charged with alleviating the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, and invariably, after the rockets stop falling on Israeli centers around the Gaza Strip, Israel would fail to fulfill its obligations. So Hamas is forced again to nudge, to restart some kind. And so it becomes a constant negotiation where Hamas can fire rockets, and the response is often case just disproportionate military assaults that, 2008, 2012, 2014 onwards decimate Palestinian populations. And then going back into some kind of strange calm where there would be a period of relief, some trucks would come in, and then the blockade would reassert itself. So that's sort of how they coexisted until I'd say 2018, when Hamas started exploring other ways of resistance, which is the Great March of Return.
So I was going to ask about the Great March of Return, which is something which is talked about a little bit here in the UK, not loads. I think people understand it as a sort of, it was a march to the so-called security fence, the sort of prison wall, effectively, of Gaza, and civilians, children were mown down in their hundreds. What was the role of Hamas in the Great March of Return? Was it coordinating? Was it organizing? Was it responding to something that was organically blossoming within Gaza? How did that work?
So the Great March of Return was very much organic. It wasn't Hamas-led. It was very much a mobilization of Palestinian civil society in Gaza that was meant to last for a certain period of day between Land Day in March and the anniversary of the Nakba in May. And during that period, Palestinians would go up to the apartheid wall, go up to this sort of security fence separating Gaza from the rest of Palestine, and demanding return through song, through march, through whatever forms of social activities. It was a very, in some ways, celebratory mobilization of Palestinians in Gaza.
And it's such a challenge to legitimacy. Well, if this isn't a prison, we can leave.
Absolutely. And the response to that was vicious. The response to that was essentially at the beginning snipers behind sand dunes, sniping off Palestinians and often with the intention to maim, if not to kill. So this mobilization became one of the broadest, most sustained mobilizations in Palestinian history. It lasted for months. And so at some point, when it was clear that Palestinians were being killed, they were basically sitting ducks in front of these snipers. So when it became clear that the Palestinians were being killed or maimed, and there was really not only no response from the Israelis, almost no coverage internationally to this incredible instance of mobilization, Hamas got involved. Not just Hamas, all of the political factions in Gaza got involved in order to support these mobilizations. So they would bus people to the fence and back. They would provide food. They would provide tactical coordination. And as the number of casualties increased, ultimately Hamas was pulled in with rocket fire. So they would start firing rockets. And in some ways, I view that moment in some ways as a precursor to 2023. In some ways, Hamas is understanding that negotiations don't work. popular mobilization and unarmed resistance doesn't work, the only time that Israel starts responding actually to the demands in 2018 and to begin alleviating the impact of the blockade is when Hamas fires rockets. So there's no way to engage with Israel that isn't through force.
So the reason why I wanted to do this interview with you is that you are basically the only person I've seen in mainstream Western media talking about Hamas from a strategic perspective and saying, well, look, these are rational actors, and you can't just say October 7th, Operation Al Aqsa Flood is a sort of, monstrous explosion of violence and bloodthirstiness. And so I want to ask about Operation Al Aqsa Flood through that strategic lens. Did Hamas understand that what they were going to do is sacrifice their governance of Gaza in pursuit of a wholly military strategy? Was that something that was factored in, costed in, priced in? Or was there a miscalculation, either in terms of how far Hamas militants would go on October 7th or the ferocity of the Israeli retaliation?
I mean, listen, there's in some ways it's an impossible question to answer because I haven't studied obviously the archives of the movement since the publication of my book, and there's still a fog of war around specifically the days leading to October 7th and Hamas's decision to carry out the attack. But I can say a few things in response to that I'm just based on my sort of analytical take. I believe to be true. One is that the operation on the day, Tufan al-Aqsa, on the day, didn't necessarily go the way that Hamas had planned for various reasons, including the fact that there wasn't an awareness of the music festival that was taking place just outside of the Gaza Strip. And I don't think there was ever the assumption that the operation into Israel would go unchallenged for that long, which essentially meant that Hamas was in historic Palestine on Israeli-controlled territory for much longer, and that there was a breach in the security fence that meant that other Palestinians, not just Hamas militants, were in that space for much longer. So in some ways, there was a loss of the kind of hierarchical control that Hamas might have been able to employ in an operation of this scale. So many things happened that I don't think were necessarily strategically determined or aimed by the movement or the movement's leadership. Now, what were its intentions? The way that I read its intentions was that the movement was understanding that several things were underway. One, Israel was becoming increasingly ingratiated within the Arab regimes through the Abraham Accords, the so-called Abraham Accords, the peace agreements, and Israel. Palestine was dropping on the agenda internationally, and there was increased Israeli violence against the Palestinian population. Don't forget that before October 7th, that was the deadliest year for Palestinians in decades, specifically Palestinian children in the West Bank. The settler violence against Palestinians was unmatched. And so all of these factors, and the fact that Hamas had just, the Great March of Return and then the Unity Intifada, nothing was changing the balance of forces. The way that I read Hamas's operations was as a major disruption to this idea that Israel can continue to be legitimated, can continue to exist the way it does. Palestinians can continue to be ignored, and that this structure has to be disrupted. And it's a sort of effort to go into historic Palestine and into Israeli-controlled territory was an effort to disrupt this idea that you can keep Palestinians behind walls and forget about them and pretend that everything else can go as normal. And so this disruption, I think, to your point, did they think that did they underestimate the Israeli response? Did they throw sort of their idea of government? I don't know that they expected the operation to go the way it did. And so I don't think they might have expected that, 2 years on, we'd still be in an ongoing genocide. I think they miscalculated the response of allies in the region and certainly of Palestinians elsewhere. I think they expected Palestinians elsewhere to be able to rise up, whether in 48 or in the West Bank. They expected Hezbollah, I think, to come in much quicker. So I think there was a miscalculation in terms of Israel's ability to isolate Gaza in this way, and certainly the international community's willingness to maintain a genocide for 2 years. So I think all of these were not necessarily on its radar. They should have been. They weren't. But I think fundamentally, it really just wanted to disrupt the structure of apartheid.
I mean, there's so many follow-on questions from this, and I'm trying to pick which one to go for. I mean, I suppose, because you wrote a sort of updated forward to this book in 2024, and even just in that intervening year, there's so much more that's happened. Hamas has not been destroyed. The genocide is still ongoing, even though we're in a ceasefire, which for Israel means you cease, we fire. It doesn't seem to be the case that the genocide has delegitimized Hamas in the eyes of Palestinians, far from it. But what might its future look like now that the axis of resistance of, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran having to contend with a sort of historic incursion of its own territorial sovereignty by Israel. What happens now that Hamas is not able to rely on allies in the region? And that's before we even start thinking about Syria.
I think as an organization, Hamas has obviously been severely weakened. The idea that Hamas can be defeated, which I've said from the beginning, is really just an excuse to carry out a genocide, because Hamas cannot be defeated as an ideology. I mean, I think this idea that Palestinians have the right to resist for the full liberation of Palestine will continue to exist, whether as Hamas or as other forms. And so this idea of defeating Hamas that Netanyahu is and the rest of the Israeli establishment is committed to, I think is really just an excuse it's a red herring. It's an excuse to keep the genocide going. But organizationally, Hamas has been severely weakened. Its top leadership has been executed. It's lost a lot of fighters, even though more fighters keep coming into its ranks, but it has lost a lot of fighters. And as you say, it's lost a lot of its lifelines from its allies across the region. Now, in the past, Hamas has gone through periods of basically revival. So new leadership comes aboard. They develop their internal capabilities to develop military, to have a rank and file. So I do think that the movement probably will try to resuscitate itself. Whether or not it's going to be able to do that in the short to medium term or the longer term in any effective way remains to be seen. A lot of this depends on what happens in the Gaza Strip now and how the Israelis will continue to occupy, what phases the genocide will evolve in. I think that will determine a lot of Hamas's, at least military capability within the occupied territories. Obviously, Hamas's leadership abroad continues to exist and they continue to make their own decisions. So in some ways, the way I view it is that the movement has been severely weakened, but it could possibly revive itself. But I have no doubt that Hamas or otherwise, this ideology of resistance will persist. The question is, will there be enough ability, given the ongoing genocide, given the degree of Israeli repression, for any effective resistance to reestablish itself?
I mean, you use the phrase equilibrium of violence to describe the containment period and this equilibrium of violence between Israel and Hamas. But Israel has shown its willingness to completely upend that equilibrium of violence. So the genocide, the entire cutoff of food and water and fuel at various points of the genocide, but also pursuing Hamas's political leadership in Qatar, right? That's something that's new. How does that change how the resistance might work in the future? Is it inevitable that it will become a much more decentralized, disaggregated force now that Israel has shown a willingness to employ these tactics, which it hasn't quite before with Hamas?
No, it's a very good question. I mean, look, I think October 7th in some ways triggered an Israeli response that was existential. So I think what October 7th did, and I've said this before, I think what October 7th did is it shattered the illusion at the heart of Zionism, which is that there can be safety for Jews in Palestine without having to deal with the indigenous population. October 7th shattered that. And the response from Israel was genocide. So if we cannot contain, if we cannot have this equilibrium where we continue to exist and Palestinians are happy behind their walls and in their prisons, if we can't have this structure, then we will remove all Palestinians. That's the only way to continue to exist as a Jewish state, ethnic cleansing or extermination. And that's what this genocide is. And the way that it's been carried out, the degree of impunity, the Western complicity in the genocide meant that Israel, as you say, went even further and said, not only are we exterminating Palestinians here, we're redrawing the map of the Middle East. We're going to stay in Syria, we're going to decimate Hezbollah in Lebanon and stay in Lebanon. We're going to carry out attacks against an American ally like Qatar, where there's one of the biggest bases in the region. We're going to carry out sovereign attacks against Iran or attack other sovereign nations such as Iran. We're going to carry out pager explosions throughout Lebanon in civilian centers and can do all of this without any kind of pushback, including starvation, including all of the ways in which the genocide has sort of been live streamed on our phones with barely a peep from the West. So I think to think about what that means in terms of resistance is very difficult. I think we're in a new world in which now we see an apartheid regime live streaming a genocide for 2 years, and then all the diplomatic language is about how we do reconstruction and ceasefire. There's no accountability. In some ways, this has opened up globally a sort of a future where it's possible to carry out horrendous acts of genocide.
If Israel can, why can't I?
Exactly. And so how do we resist this? In some ways, this is a question for Palestinians in the immediate sense of this apartheid regime, in the immediate sense of survival. How do we stop a genocide, and how do we make sure we're not exterminated as a people? But this is a question that's far bigger than Palestine now. This is a global question. How do we exist in a world in which this kind of genocide is not only tolerated but advanced, and how do we resist that?
I mean, you've argued that Mamdani's rise is impossible to understand without Palestine, and I suppose what I'm interested to hear about from you is that you have these municipal or national socialist candidates or socialist parties, and they're having to reckon with the fact that their political moment was birthed because of the Palestine movement, but also they're having to speak to an electorate, most of which considers Palestine a lower order issue than their immediate cost of living, or even issues such as immigration, so on and so forth. If there's no way through to either justice or fascism without going through Palestine, how would you advise these politicians to sort of balance their policy platform and their messaging between bread and butter domestic issues and this thing which is of existential global importance?
I mean, I think Mamdani does it brilliantly in the sense that Mamdani's politics aren't necessarily on Palestine. Someone like Mamdani is interested in the well-being of New Yorkers and in the fact that New York has become a city that's unaffordable. The cost of living crisis is horrendous. The level of homelessness is mad. And that's his focus. But he also understands that there's a link that can be drawn between that and Palestine in the sense that a lot of the money that could be going to Americans is being channeled to fund a genocide, and in order to secure an ally that is increasingly fascist and increasingly uncontrollable. And so why is that money being funneled out? Now, the base, Mamdani's base, part of the reason that I said Mamdani's rise can be linked to Palestine is that his base was energized in the aftermath of the genocide. Now, obviously their immediate priorities are the cost of living in New York, and that's why they see him, his socialist credentials, as someone who can carry the base. But the base was energized through the genocide. That's when a lot of the younger base was politicized. And so in some ways, Palestine becomes this lightning rod, this way in which people understand politics and how vacuous these political establishments are. Why is so much taxpayer money going from the US to sustain a genocide? And why can't you ask that question? And so someone like Mamdani comes and asks that question and says, actually, my first trip isn't going to be to Israel because I care more about the
it's going to be to Staten Island.
To Staten Island. And someone's thinking, why has our political system been so skewed that we actually understand these things that are untouchable as sort of a given that we can't challenge. No, you can challenge them. These are fundamentals that I think are reshaping how we think about politics.
I mean, I sort of think that the role that Palestine plays in the Western left is really similar to the role that South African apartheid played. So it's a moral outrage. I think that people feel the moral affront first and then they develop the politics
Right.
afterwards. But it has that ruthless clarity about it. And when I see the way in which it animates, not just friends of mine, but family members as
Right.
well, I think that's the only thing you can really compare it to.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that I think about a lot is, why isn't Sudan giving that moral outrage, at least a reshaping politics, let's say, in the Western world? And I think part of the reason is because the West is so complicit in Israeli apartheid. The West is so complicit in Zionism. And it's because of the West's own discomfort with questions around anti-Semitism. The genocide of the Jews happened on European soil, not in Palestine. And I think the West hasn't been able to contend with its own history of colonialism, with its own history of anti-Semitism, with its own history of white supremacy, and instead exported these questions and maintained.
You could see Germany loving it. Germany being like, we're not the anti-Semites anymore.
Absolutely. And so I think what Palestine is doing is in some ways coming back into these sort of dark corners of the Western narratives and the West's conception of itself, and is really challenging Western hegemony. This idea that international law, the ICC, the ICJ, can continue to sort of be completely co-opted and manipulated by the West as versus being egalitarian systems for the globe. I think, and so in some ways, Palestine is really striking at the heart of what remains to be done in terms of decolonization globally.
I mean, before we move on to talk about your memoir, which is just so beautifully written, I guess I want to ask a sort of personal political question, which is, there are going to be people watching this interview, maybe they work for Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, maybe it's Melanie Phillips herself, who are going to be like, look at these two terrorist sympathizers providing intellectual cover or justification for Hamas. How have you, as a researcher, as an intellectual, but also someone whose family history is tied to the liberation of Palestine, navigated that context of being able to publish analysis which is thoroughly researched and as accurate and as honest as you're capable of doing, whilst there is such an extreme climate of censorship?
I mean, my goal when I was doing my doctorate on Hamas and then publishing Hamas Contained was really to get out of the way. I felt that my role as a researcher was to try to understand this movement on its own terms. So there was so much demonization, so much willful and misguided narratives around Hamas. I really just wanted to provide a research that can allow Hamas to explain its own narratives. What are their political and strategic goals? So for about a decade, I immersed myself in Hamas's archives. And my role was that of a translator in some ways, was to get out of the way and to get Hamas to speak on its own terms without judgment for or against, without sort of taking a personal opinion on Hamas, but really to allow Hamas to, and the only way to do that was to really ground myself in their archives, in their written word, in their oral testimonies, in their...
How did you get access to it?
I mean, I did a lot of interviews with Hamas's leadership abroad. I wasn't allowed into Palestine until I naturalized as a UK citizen. So my doctorate was mostly doing it from abroad. And then once I naturalized, I traveled to Palestine and then into the Gaza Strip. And it's not necessarily that difficult to sort of meet people in Gaza. And I was able to meet the various leaders and archivists and librarians who were able to give me the material I needed.
What was it like going to Palestine for the first time?
So I first went to Palestine in 2015. So it was a few months after the end of the Israeli military assault in 2014. And I had just naturalized as a British citizen, and it was my first trip actually on a UK passport. So obviously, I would go to Palestine,
Not
and
Disneyland.
not Disneyland, and it was incredible. I mean, in some ways, it was everything that I had expected because I had spent more than a decade. Researching it, so studying it intellectually, but obviously I grew up in a Palestinian home, and so there was this strange, intense feeling of familiarity that I had been there before, and I think it was in the fact that I had in the accents and the cooking and the affect and the discourse and just the understanding of self, and so there was this very intense feeling of belonging of being in a space that's strangely familiar. But also it was a difficult trip because especially going to Gaza and then leaving Gaza, knowing that I can go in and leave when the majority of people can't travel, seeing how apartheid works, the
Was there anything that
checkpoints
surprised you about the experience of being there?
in Gaza. I write about this a bit in the book. The thing that I was most was a joy. There's so much. There was so much joy. There was so much life, and it sounds nonsensical saying it now because of course there was joy and there was life. But being an outsider, reading mostly about Gaza being under blockade, the military assaults, the the inhumanity of maintaining the blockade, the humanitarian effect of that, one goes in expecting the worst. And so the level of joy, the sort of the how everyday life continued to exist in sort of both beautiful and aggravating ways, the normalcy of everything, was a bit not unexpected. It actually reminded me of my parents and how they talk about Beirut, this, in the middle of civil war, going out to parties or having this incredible social life. And in some ways, it was that in Gaza, sort of in the middle of these most inhuman situations, having life and joy and happiness. And I think that was just wonderful to behold.
I was talking to a friend from Ramallah who was talking about the Palestinian Authority had constructed a fountain, and the fountain had sort of kicked off this whole discourse of like, should we be having a fountain? Like, there's a genocide going on, but no, because there is a genocide, we must enjoy the fountain. And she was saying that there is something that she wants to do as a writer, which is, yes, there is this extreme suffering, but that extreme suffering has also created these absurdities and these things which are so idiosyncratic to the Palestinian experience. And she wanted to write about it. And she wants to write about it in a way which is not just about being the perfect victim and not just about putting across the sort of political case, but to really be in the body, right? And be in the perspective and be in the experience and share that in her writing. And I was thinking about that when I was reading your memoir, which is there is this messiness and humanity to how the various figures in your life are responding to their experiences. And I was wondering, how did you square that with your politics? Did you ever want to protect people a little bit because you were worried about how it would be interpreted politically as being a statement about Arabness or Palestinianness?
Yes, I did. Often. I mean, I think there are instances in the book where I don't know that Palestinians come off in the best light, or where Jordanians, where I was born and raised, come off in the best light. I'm very aware that there were various instances in the book that I touch on that are misaligned with my politics and make me cringe thinking about the idea that this is how I'm representing. But I think this is exactly it. I'm not representing. I think this book is a memoir. So it's my particular experience in this space. And I felt that to write a memoir, I needed to write an authentic experience, with all of the ugliness and with all of the beauty in that. And so it was a very conscious decision to not try to write what I want people to hear or what I think people should think about Palestine or about the region. I wanted to reflect what these spaces are in all of their messiness and in all of their complexities, because that's the only truthful way of accounting for our humanity. We're not none of us are perfect. So I think it was a commitment to the messiness in some ways.
I mean, were you tempted to hide a little bit and to go like, okay, well, instead of a memoir, I'm going to do autofiction or something which gives you that little bit of deniability or distance?
Yes, 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 yes. And now on the other side of publishing, I wonder why I didn't do that. Yes, I mean, of course, I played with the idea of autofiction. I played with the idea of a pseudonym. I played with the idea of writing it as a novel.
What would your pseudonym have been?
Oh, I'm not going to say because there are pieces under a pseudonym out
Oh,
there.
wow.
So, but I ultimately felt that I needed to write that. In some ways, the whole point of the book is to push back against the idea that we need to hide or we need to hide parts of ourselves in order to be accepted. And I felt it would be disingenuous if I was putting that message while I was also hiding, and so I felt that I had a political commitment. I had a commitment to owning this narrative.
I mean, the theme of hiding and shame, and the word for shame being, tell me if I'm pronouncing this right, aib. I'm so bad at reading words which I've never heard and then just butchering them on
You
the
did it,
first go.
actually. You did very well.
Aib. It's a recurring force in the memoir. When did you first begin to understand the role that shame had in disciplining and conditioning your experience of the world?
Oh, very young age, at a very young age. I think it was sort of unspoken in some ways. The way that a child is just attuned to, his mother's look or his father's sort of double take or whatever it is. But I think understanding that the way that I existed in the world was not okay, was disruptive, was something that I think has always been with me. And I think it was intuited more than it was understood in childhood. And I think it was in some ways, and I reflect a bit on that in the memoir, at the beginning, in some ways, not necessarily something that I really understood or grappled with. It was a bit of an ambivalent relationship with it. And only when it started when it turned into bullying, when it turned into this overt, explicit denunciation of how I am, how I existed as a child, did I understand that, I need to police this, I need to change that.
Did you understand it as being about, queer desire and queer love, or was it a sort of much more amorphous form of shame? So shame could attach itself to desire, but it would also just attach itself to anything.
It wasn't about queerness in the sense that I didn't understand myself as a queer individual. Like that language didn't, you were talking Amman in the 80s, 90s, pre-internet, very conservative, very small society. This language didn't exist. I didn't have any reference in my immediate environment about what same-sex desire looked like or what queerness was. And so it was actually a shame about difference, this sense of you don't quite belong here. You don't know why you don't belong, and you don't know what it is that you're doing that's reinforcing that idea, but this sense that who you are in your entirety is off. And I grew up in a very religious home, a Christian religious home. And so this Catholic guilt, this sort of, this like quest for absolution, this need to always pray to be absolved.
I have to work so hard to be good because I was born in sin.
Pretty much animated my childhood. Yeah.
I mean, my husband is so unencumbered by shame, and I kind of, I'm so jealous of it, resent him a little bit. But I, in a weird way, I sometimes think of shame as being the superpower because I was so conditioned by it. It's trained me to read other people because I'm constantly looking for what I'm doing wrong. I mean, do you think that there is something in your analytic perspective or your literary voice which has come from that intense experience of shame and self-consciousness?
Absolutely. I do think it makes me more attuned to people. I think it also heightens emotional intelligence in people. It's sort of,
that's what I'm telling him.
Yes, absolutely. You should tell him. I do think that it sort of shapes sort of an understanding of how one exists that's bigger than oneself. It sort of limits this insular gaze and allows for just an understanding of how one exists in the world around them.
I mean, you take the name of the memoir, Fire in Every Direction, from a description of your mother. And I thought that was such a beautiful description. How has your understanding of her political anger and her political rage developed for you as an adult?
When I was younger, my mom was obviously, just to give context, an activist in Lebanon where she was born and raised, and faced or experienced atrocities at the beginning of the civil war that landed her in Jordan. And so I grew, and she was rebellious. She continues to be rebellious. She's an angry woman. And in childhood, as a child, I didn't necessarily understand that. I think at times I resented it. And in adulthood, I sort of got to the place where I felt that I could forgive that, because I could understand that, yes, you should be rageful against these injustices. That's the only right response to these things. And actually, only through the writing of this book did I come to a place where I understood that it wasn't actually about forgiveness, it was gratitude. I'm grateful that she taught me that this is how one exists against systems of oppression, that when you're faced with this injustice, indifference is not the answer, rage is the answer. And so I think I sort of have been reflecting a lot, especially against the backdrop of genocide, about the role of rage, and how often I'm invited into these spaces where you're expected to speak in a civil way about it, and you're recounting the extermination of your people against narratives that are biased and racist, and yet if you're angry, you're the problem. And so how does rage animate politics? How does rage animate change in the world? And I think it's something that I need to sort of own and grapple with more productively.
I mean, how does it? Let's throw that question back to you.
I think it's a necessity. I think the absence of rage now is part of the problem. I think there should be absolute rage and fury at the gaslighting, if not at what's actually happening in the genocide, but the lies and the gaslighting and the way that we are then made to feel that we are misunderstanding what we're witnessing and what we're seeing on our phones. I think that should only be met with rage. I now think that any kind of effort to try to engage with that is an acceptance of a frame that is dehumanizing and racist.
Do you mean that like on every level? Because I think for the work that I do, and I think about why am I doing it? Part of it is because I think it's really important for people who are anti-Zionist, who are anti-occupation, who are pro-Palestine, to see that reflected at the national level. Second thing is that media is a terrain of conflict, and that needs to be contested. And then there's a third thing, which is most people don't have formed opinions on this, right? And that's something to play for, but you can only do it if they see the debate being staged in some way, which requires a kind of engagement.
Absolutely. And I think all of these things are extremely valuable. And I think that this conversation is a productive conversation. But there are conversations that happen in mainstream media where the starting point is that you are inferior, or what you are witnessing, your narrative is problematic. And I think coming to that in a place of let's have a polite conversation over this is creating a symmetry between a kind of narrative, which is a Zionist or a soft Zionist narrative, or an uninformed narrative that is actively killing people and manufacturing complicity for genocide, and a narrative that's saying we shouldn't be exterminated, there's a problem here. And that symmetry is rage-inducing, and I think it should be rage-inducing. It should be confronted. It should be called out, and I think that's the only way. I don't feel like I'm coming here needing to prove anything. You're actually interested in what I have to say. There's no space for rage here. But if I'm sitting with a reporter, the starting point of which is to sort of
apologize for October 7th.
Or reinforce a Zionist narrative, then rage has a space in that kind of, has a role in that kind of space.
I think I've got my own work to do on rage, to be honest. Is that in my...
You're frightened of rage.
Oh God, yeah, because I can feel the urge to murder within me, right? So I'm
absolutely.
like, put that away.
Absolutely.
I mean, I suppose like moving away from my own difficulties with rage, I want to, the concept of home in the memoir is really important, and it shifts. How is home defined? Is it where your family of origin is? Is it geographic? Is it where you establish a chosen family? Is it where you establish an adult identity? The fact that home evolves through the memoir in so many ways, how does that interact with the political stakes of Palestinian identity and the idea of return and belonging?
I mean, I think the way that I grapple with that ultimately is through Ghassan Kanafani's return to Haifa. This idea that, in that novella, he sort of, the protagonist goes from the occupied territories into Haifa to try to find his home along with his wife. And at some point he turns to his wife and says, do you know what a homeland is? He's sort of searching for this question of what have we come back in time and in space to try to reclaim. And I really sit with this because I did a similar journey of returning to Palestine, of finding my grandmother's home. And it is this question of what am I searching for? And I think ultimately, I think that for me, home is less of a geographic place and more of sort of being whole in the self, but also being held by community and chosen family that share my values and my commitment and my purpose in life. And that's where I find myself. That's what home is for me. And in some ways, it's how I think about Palestinians as well. Even Palestinians who are in the Shatat, in the diaspora, who are unable to go back physically, until we can return, until we reclaim the land, which is obviously the highest aspiration, this return for Palestinians, we can enact return daily in our lives, in our commitment to Palestine as a political project, a way to be in the world. And I think that's what home is for me, that sort of state of being.
I mean, these are two really, really different books, right? We've got a sort of historical analysis of Hamas. We've got a beautifully written memoir. What's coming next?
Well,
it's going to be something crazy, man. Like,
you'll have to wait and see. I am working on a project now. I don't know what it is yet. It's a very short, I think it's probably a long essay or a short book thinking about this moment in time, what it means for Palestinians today. Where are we? Where do we go from here? This sort of, this Nakba that we're living. So it's a meditation, I think, on that.
Well, I'm really looking forward to reading it. And then, I don't know, your sort of update on Ulysses or whatever comes after that, and the sort of Barbie movie too, like whatever.
Not Barbie movie, no.
Oh, Tareq Baconi, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.